Welcome to the 2018 Gibb Memorial Lecture Series. For those of you who are new, I will read a little blurb about the history of this lecture series, which is a crowning jewel in the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, one of our great traditional events. The Hamilton A.R. Gibb Lecture Series in Islamic History, Social Studies, and Culture was established at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in 1964 with funds generously donated by Mr. John Gillette, himself a student of Professor Gibb. It stands as a memorial to Sir Hamilton Gibb's long-standing commitment to the expansion and deepening of teaching and research in Middle East at Harvard and beyond. Professor Gibb was Harvard's Jewett Professor of Arabic Studies, Arabic Language and Islamic Studies in the Department of Near East Languages and Civilizations, and a founding director of CMES. From 1957 to 1966, Professor Gibb became a leader in the movement in American universities to set up centers of regional studies, bringing together teachers, researchers, and students in different disciplines to study the cultures and societies of our region of the world. Named as a university professor, Sir Hamilton Gibb joined the elite ranks of senior Harvard faculty who are regarded as, and I quote, individuals of distinction working on the frontiers of knowledge and in such a way as to cross the conventional boundaries of specialties. Among some of our illustrious past Gibb lecturers, I'll just name a few. There are many, but just to give you a sense of who we had here before, George Maqdisi, Irfan Shahid, both passed away, Sir Edmund Bosworth, Nellie Hanna, Maria Isabel Fierro, Robert Wisnowski, Sherman Jackson, and Widad Al-Qadi, just to name a few. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce Nasser Rabbat, a towering figure in the field of Islamic art and architecture, a personal friend and a great scholar not only in the area of the Boston area, New England area, but a worldwide scholar of great renown. Nasser Rabbat is the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has published a massive amount of articles and books in English, Arabic, and in French. And his Italian is getting really good, so I expect there'll be one in Italian probably within the next couple of months.
It's going to be only about my impressions of Italy.
That's good enough, huh? Where's Francesca? He is the author of, I'm just going to mention 6 of his books to give you an idea of the breadth and depth of his work. His recent book, I'll start with some of the titles. Naqd Iltizaman, Criticism as Commitment, Viewpoints on History, Arabism and Revolution, that was published in Beirut in 2015. Staging the City, or How Mamluk Architecture Co-opted the Streets of Cairo, that was published in Berlin in 2014. Mamluk History Through Architecture, Building, Culture and Politics in Mamluk Egypt and Syria, that was published in 2010 in London, and it received the very prestigious British Kuwait Friendship Society Prize in Middle Eastern Studies in 2011. Al-Mudun al-Mayyata, Durus min Madiha, Ru'an lil-Mustaqbilha, The Dead Cities, Lessons from Its History and Views of Its Future, that was published in Damascus in 2010. ثقافات البناء وبناء الثقافة أو ثقافة البناء وبناء الثقافة, The Culture of Building and the Building Culture, that was published in Beirut in 2002. And the last of his many that I'm going to cite today, The Citadel of Cairo, A New Interpretation of Royal Mamluk Architecture, that was published in Leiden in 1995. He's co-edited several books as well, Interpreting the Self, Autobiography in the Arabic Literary Tradition, and Making Cairo Medieval in 2005. Professor Rabbat has worked as an architect himself in both Los Angeles and in Damascus. He was a visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, or the ESS as we know it in American, in Paris in 2009, and the Ludwig, I'm sorry, I apologize for my German, the Ludwig Maximans Universität, pretty good, in Munich in 2007. He has spent time as a in the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here at Harvard, the American Research Center in Egypt, and the H.A.R de l'Institut du Monde Arabe, the Paul Getty postdoctoral fellowship, and most recently, if I remember correctly, he was recently in Rome at the American Academy in Rome, where he delivered a series of lectures. He contributes regularly to Arabic and Middle Eastern publications. He sits on extensive boards, etc. And I just, if I can pull from my text and say, for those of you who know Nasser, he is a scholar of tremendous depth and breadth. He is a scholar of Islamic architecture as well as urban history, of intellectual history. His work bridges the medieval and the modern. He is in many ways has become a public intellectual. He makes Islamic art and architecture very relevant in the modern world. And his work is thoroughly grounded in the humanities and the social sciences. And I'm very, very happy to say that he's accepted to be our Gibb lecturer for this year. So a warm welcome for the guy down the road, MIT.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon. I'm very happy to be giving the Gibb lectures. I have been coming to them for about 34 years now, and wondering when is my turn. And so it finally came. And I'm actually also very happy to be giving the lecture today in the Gibb series, because it's my attempt, as a matter of fact, at sort of like doing something in the spirit of Gibb. And in particular, those of you who know his scholarship, this is an addendum to his article, Tarikh, on history. This essay that all of us who do Islamic studies have had to read it at one point or another. Today is my attempt at actually adding few footnotes, if you want, or few, perhaps, characters to the article on history. Next time, I'll go back to my sort of like training and original training in a sense, and it will be a lecture with images. Today, you're just gonna have to look at me. So, when Ibn Khaldun arrived to Cairo in January of 1383, he exuberantly exclaimed, "I beheld the metropolis of the world, orchid of the universe, hive of nations, Iwan of Islam, throne of royalty, bursting with palaces and Iwans within, shining on the horizon with khanqahs and madrasas, illuminated by the moons and stars of its learned scholars, which appeared on the banks of the Nile, river of paradise, flowing with the waters of the sky." Despite its florid wordiness, this statement embodies something of a fulfillment for this consummate wanderer who had spent more than 30 years honing his skills as a courtier, administrator, jurist, and schemer in various courts of North Africa and Al-Andalus before giving up in despair of ever attaining the high office he deserved. He tried seclusion in the Qal'at Bani Salama in Algeria for 3 years, where he drafted his famous intro to the sociology of history, the Muqaddimah, between 1372 and 1375, but could not bear being away from urban life and from libraries in particular. He returned to Tunis before ultimately escaping to Mamluk Egypt, where he was to spend the last 23 years of his life, with a few trips to the Hijaz to do the Hajj or to Syria. In Cairo, Ibn Khaldun finally found his match, a city that displayed all the amenities of civilization, to use his word, Umran, as he had analyzed them in his Muqaddimah. Indeed, the city was a major center of trade and industrial production, a premier locus of learning, the beneficiary of the country's immense agricultural wealth, and, most important to Ibn Khaldun, the capital of a powerful state led by a caste of many-muted fighters whose ruling system has created a strong, albeit artificial asabiyya, or group solidarity among them. This condition, Ibn Khaldun perceptively observed, ensured the survival of the state, which greatly depended on the intensity of the camaraderie, or the khushdashiyya, to use their own word, and its concomitant fighting instinct among the freshly uprooted Mamluks who formed the reservoir of the ruling class. It is that quality that saved Egypt, and by extension Islam itself, from the onslaught of external invasions throughout the 14th century. In Cairo, Ibn Khaldun became a teacher of fiqh in a venerated Cairene madrasa, then rose to serve as the chief Maliki judge a few times. He seems to have met al-Maqrizi, a young man of around 18 years of age, with a traditional ulama education and a pronounced eagerness to learn shortly after his arrival. But we do not know how or when or where. Al-Maqrizi fast became a regular in the circle of Ibn Khaldun, even though the cocky Ibn Khaldun never mentions al-Maqrizi. Contemporary commentators, including al-Maqrizi himself, situate the relationship at the level of mentor-student. In fact, al-Maqrizi refers to Ibn Khaldun with utmost reverence, praises his knowledge, often quotes directly from his dictation, and records many discussions he had with Ibn Khaldun, which prove that their relationship lasted until the end of Ibn Khaldun's life. Some modern scholars, like Robert Irwin, focused on the common interest the two men had in the occult sciences in general, but distinguished between their engagement in these pursuits. Others, such as Anne Broadbridge and Sabri Jarrar, detected a certain intellectual affinity between the Khaldunian notions of history's cyclical pattern and the method and structure of several of al-Maqrizi's historical treatises. Here, I am proposing that the intellectual relationship between the two men was complementary, although there is a clear line of tutelage from Ibn Khaldun to al-Maqrizi. Living at a historical juncture when the dominant polity in the Islamic world depended primarily on legitimization through power, sultan that is, and this is where we get the title from, both men were interested in the structure of state, in the city as the locus of power, and in the lessons the past can teach us about both state and city. Ibn Khaldun was the generalist and the theorist of history and its methods, and al-Maqrizi, the case study investigator, who is more attentive to the quotidien and who spent most of his career writing about the history of Egypt and more particularly Cairo. Unlike most historians of their time, both men took up a critical stance vis-à-vis the history they were recording, conceived and presented from within the epistemological framework of a medieval Muslim thinker. In other words, pre-humanist, inherently deterministic, and ultimately moralistic. They also tended to be rather pessimistic about the future, as they could read it from the conditions of the present, with Ibn Khaldun framing his pessimism in an abstract cyclical trajectory of rise and fall of states, while al-Maqrizi focusing his attention on the deteriorating here and now. Whether this reciprocity was understood by the two men or not is impossible to prove. But a few references in al-Maqrizi's writing hint at how he was able to appropriate a number of the master's concepts, such as causality as the basis of any historical explanation, the cycles of rise and decline of state and city, and the relationship between prosperity and political stability, and test them in several of his historical treatises, most clearly in his famous Kitab al-Mawa'iz wal-i'tibar bi-dhikr al-khitat wal-athar, or the book of moral sermons and lessons derived from the remembrance of cities' traces and building remains, abbreviated as the Khitat, which is essentially an inquiry into the history of Cairo and the vagaries of its ruling dynasties down to his own time. Of course, Ibn Khaldun too was interested in the city, and Cairo too figures heavily in his thinking, especially as he was reworking his Muqaddimah, meant as the introduction to his large historical survey of the Islamic states of his time, Kitab al-Ibar, which he was updating and revising throughout his years in Egypt. In his Muqaddimah, he posits an overarching cycle of rise and fall of dynasties as a hermeneutical framework in explaining historical process. Profiting from his long exposure to the politics of his age and his wide and profound reading in the historical, legal, theological, and literary works available to a Muslim scholar of his stature, Ibn Khaldun offers the most original pre-modern sociological treatment of history, historiography, the nomadic settled dichotomy as an engine of state formation, the characteristics and conditions of urbanity, politics, social classes, economics, and knowledge. The Muqaddima's fourth section in particular, dealing with the sociology of urban life, is a lucid analysis of the tripartite relationship between the city, the state, and civilization, and an interpretation of the rise and fall of cities as a function of the rise and fall of states. But for Ibn Khaldun, the city was principally an abstract analytical tool put in the service of the new science he founded, which he called Ilm al-Umran. And this has to be translated as the science of civilization, but also the science of urbanization, which to Ibn Khaldun were mutually dependent concepts. Within that framework, he conceived of the city as both the locus of civilization and the barometer and causative container of the rise and fall of state. To him, the historical process is one of cyclical change, basically reflecting the interplay between two groups, the nomads and the city dwellers, with power residing in the former and politics and productiveness in the latter. His cycle goes roughly as follows. The nomads, united by kin solidarity, asabiyya that is, conquer the softer city and establish a dynasty that rules over the urban population and employs it in its service. The first generation of rulers retain tribal virtue and solidarity and are thus strong and in total control. The second is forced to depend on bureaucrats and military recruits to manage its domain and preserve its hold on power. But it also encourages commerce, crafts, and knowledge. The third generation loses most of its ethical bearings and group solidarity and succumbs to corruption, oppression, and the decadent luxuries city life encourages. This leads to the fall of the dynasty with the fourth generation and the ruin of the city at the hand of more rigorous new nomadic conquerors who will presumably repeat the cycle again. Of course, Ibn Khaldun was reflecting the realities of North Africa in his time. There are in Ibn Khaldun's conception of the city paradoxical echoes of at least two opposing traditions of interpreting the city. One is condemnatory and may have its origin in the Quranic depiction of the city, itself influenced by biblical notions of the city as both desired and damned by the nomadic Hebrews, whereby some of the cities of past nations, which have reveled in excess and perversion, ignored their religious duties and chased out God's prophets, deserved God's fire and brimstone. But even though Ibn Khaldun casts the city as inevitably the corrupter of austere virtues by its intricate industry and tempting luxuries, he takes his cues in predicting the consequences of this perversion, not from divine action, but from socio-political dynamics, which lead, if not to the annihilation of the city, at least to its conquest by new vigorous invaders hungry for its bounties. The second tradition is rather laudatory and even boastful, since Ibn Khaldun saw himself as the consummate urbanite, especially when he was maneuvering among the semi-nomadic dynasties of the Maghrib. This tradition is manifest in the enormous section in the Muqaddimah. It's almost half the text of the Muqaddimah, where Ibn Khaldun admiringly discusses the various attributes of the city: its administration, artisans, industries, wealth generation, social norms, and various sciences and literary pursued within, which cannot be undertaken without the urban framework. And I have no doubt that it is the model of Cairo, which he encountered toward the end of its golden period, that informs his elaborate classifications in this section, more so than the cities of North Africa and Al-Andalus, in which he spent his youth and early adulthood, and which pale in comparison to the grandeur of Cairo. But if for Ibn Khaldun, Cairo is a laterly discovered superior model of urbanity, for al-Maqrizi, it is the ultimate paradigm around which his entire understanding of the city revolves. This is, of course, a function of his filial belonging to Cairo, which prompted him to write his khitat in the first place, as he says in his introduction, and I'm quoting, Misr. In this context, Misr means both the country and the city of Cairo, is the place of my birth, the playground of my mates, the nexus of my society and clan, the home to my family and public, the bosom where I acquired my wings, and the niche I seek and yearn to. Ever since I sought knowledge and God gave me intelligence and understanding, I have wanted to know its events, أخبارها, to draw from its wells of information, and to question travelers on the inhabitants of its countries. So over many years, I recorded in my own handwriting and collected many accounts that are seldom gathered in a book held between two covers because of their rarity and their peculiarity. In this one sentence, al-Maqrizi packs a series of powerful concepts of belonging that constitute a good portion of any romantic definition of patriotism. To a committed nationalist of any stripe, a homeland is indeed the place of birth, the environment of socialization, the setting of personal experience and growth, and the locus of memories and passions. Deploying his mastery of rhyming prose, so favored in medieval literature, al-Maqrizi still manages to express his love of Cairo in a direct, heartfelt, and moving way. And it is emotion, indeed, that guides al-Maqrizi's writing in the Khitat, more so than the detached and calculating intellect of his master in the Muqaddimah. His book is highly opinionated and melancholy in its coverage, morally critical in its tone, and inherently teleological in its conclusions, which are dispersed throughout the text. Its style is literary and legalistic, reflecting the educational and professional background of its author, although it is clear that al-Maqrizi is trying to keep his prose as direct and matter-of-fact as possible, avoiding intricate language and limiting both the use of poetry and Quranic quotations, the two mainstays of medieval scholarly prowess and affectation. The Khitat opens with a brief topographic survey of Egypt, followed by a summary of its pre-Islamic history. The urban history section begins with a succinct review of the major Egyptian cities. Al-Maqrizi then quickly moves to the site of Cairo and reviews its ancient history, then examines the first appearance of an Islamic city, Al-Fustat, on the site of the ancient Roman fort of Babylon and its growth and ruin. Next, he analyzes the founding of Fatimid al-Qahira, or Cairo, and spends a sizable segment of the book favorably describing the many spectacular structures and the order and decorum the Fatimids established in them, and in Egypt in general, as well as their mission, the da'wah, and its hierarchical structure. The second half of the book deals with Cairo in the Ayyubid and Mamluk period down to his own time. Following a clear typological structure, Cairo's quarters, streets, squares, famous mansions, hammams, khans, apartment buildings called Rabbat, markets, urban zones, hukr, bridges, ponds, hippodromes, citadels, mosques, madrasas, hospitals, khankas, shrines and zawiyas, cemeteries and mausolea, and synagogues and churches are arranged in this order and are each recorded, dated, and their location described. The lists are neither exhaustive nor complete, which suggests that al-Maqrizi was not done with the book's preparation when he died. Moreover, section 6 of the book's original structure, the history of the citadel of Cairo, bisects the architectural inventory. Woven into this typological narrative are short biographies of the patrons of all the city's monuments, which are usually attached to the description of their buildings. In addition, the text is speckled with copious entries on Cairo's wonders and religious merits and the ceremonies observed by its people. Further digressions add to the impression of a work in progress that was still in need of extensive editing when its author stopped working on it 2 years before his death, most probably because of his prolonged final illness. The book as it stands is thus a cumulative work, both in its scope and its depth of treatment of the various topics it comprises. The different strata of the texts that reached us reflect not only al-Maqrizi's evolving methods and views on history, but also his changing mood and circumstances, which were getting gloomier by the year, and the growth and diversification of his data on Egypt during the book's long period of gestation. It's actually 23 years. And my book on al-Maqrizi has taken me so far 20 years, and I'm planning to publish it in 3 years, just in honor of al-Maqrizi. The book's main motifs, however, seem to have been set from the beginning and maintained, if not reinforced, with every reduction of the text. They are homage to the Fatimids and their patronage in building Cairo, nostalgia for the bygone days of the city at its apogee, presumed to be the period of Nasser Muhammad in the first half of the 14th century, because he repeatedly praises that period. And third, prediction of perdition or ruination, kharab, under al-Maqrizi's contemporary Burji or Circassian Mamluk sultans, of whom he was scathingly dismissive. Al-Maqrizi may have begun thinking about writing a history of Cairo from as early as 803 Hijr or 1400, when he started to read available sources on its history. And I've documented about 6 or 7 of these books and the years in which he read them. The mihna, the calamity of 806 or 1403, 1404, which caused famine and economic collapse in Cairo, provided the impetus for him to try his hands at history writing, whereas his extensive hisba or market inspection experience and his dismissal from that position in 807 or 1405 engendered the thematic frame for his inquiry. His first exercise in that direction, the Ilasat al-Ummah bikashf al-Ghumma, focused on the history of famines, mismanagement, and monetary history, and was possibly meant as a policy recommendation for the Mamluks. But the strong feelings that animated this rather short treatise reappear in more elaborate ways in the Khitat, which al-Maqrizi continued working on almost until his death. The themes to corruption, neglect of Sharia, negations of traditions, exploitation of power, devastation of agricultural land, monetary irregularities, low Nile flooding, plague, and dangerous inflation, which he identified as the causes of the suffering he witnessed in the Mihna of 1400, seem to have steered his analysis toward the gloomily predicted kharab of his city in the Khitat. Unfortunately, though, al-Maqrizi does not manage to complete a full-fledged discussion on kharab, which he announces as the final section of the Khitat in his introduction and refers to it several times in the narrative. Instead, we have a few short and difficult-to-date discussions of kharab dispersed in the narrative. The one exception is a short and perceptive analysis tucked into the description of the tibaq, or the barracks of the young Mamluks in the citadel of Cairo, where al-Maqrizi characteristically digresses to describe the changes from the strict system that governed their training in the Bahri period to the slackening of rules under Sultan Barquq, and especially his son Faraj. Al-Maqrizi nostalgically opines, Mamluks used to be bought at a young age and were put through rigorous training and a thorough religious education before they were manumitted and enlisted in the army. That is why they were skillful and thoughtful leaders who managed a great empire and fought for the cause of Islam. The system was relaxed under Barquq, who allowed his Mamluks to live in the city and to socialize with the local population through marriage and business transactions. It deteriorated even further under Faraj ibn Barquq, when new Mamluks were brought at a fairly advanced age, after their character had already been formed and were no longer required to undergo an extensive religious education before their manumission. Consequently, the Mamluks became the lowest of people, the most undignified and greedy, and the most ignorant in worldly matters and in religion. They became more lustful than monkeys, more ravenous than rats, and more harmful than wolves. No wonder then that the land of Egypt and Asham was ruined, kharibat, from the Nile to the Euphrates because of the venality in assigning governing position, the exploitation of governors, and the depravity of those in charge, i.e. the Mamluks. End of quotation. It is in this passage that al-Maqrizi works out the most important underlying causes for the kharab that he is trying throughout his khitat to articulate. The natural and external causes are of lesser concern, and some of them, as noted by Julien Loiseau, go unnoticed. It is the incremental political corrosion that he is after. And in the khitat, he was able to take a long view on history that allowed him better to understand how a country and its glorious capital, so blessed and so resilient against past calamities, at least from his little informed perch, have succumbed to the current irreversible kharab that he was so bitterly lamenting. Thus, the notion of kharab not only played a central role in the development of al-Maqrizi's thinking about the Mamluk rule of his time and its effect on his city, it also represented one of the strongest impulses that drove him to conceive of his large project of preserving the history of Egypt, which comprises 7 multi-volume books and more than a dozen short treatises, trying among them to record the political and cultural history of Islamic Egypt and the lives of its notable citizens. But as I suggested, a weightier influence on al-Maqrizi's argument and book structure is the conceptual cyclical framework of the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. The impact of Ibn Khaldun's cyclical history emerges from the analysis of a number of al-Maqrizi's thematic treatises, such as those on the causes of famine, there are 2 of them, and the strife between the Umayyad and the Alid, there are 2 of these treatises as well. But is most conspicuously evident in the structure and argument of the Khitat. There, al-Maqrizi seems to have subsumed the overarching cycle of dynastic rise and fall to organize the vast amount of material he collected on the city over the years into a general discourse on Cairo's urban history and topography. He also devised an analogous cycle of prosperity and urban expansion, followed by decay and urban contraction, to frame his account of the fate of the city under the successive dynasties that ruled Egypt in the Islamic era. The political fortune of each ruling dynasty is plotted against the fluctuation of the urban and architectural prosperity of Cairo during the same time in a way that echoes the Khaldunian view on history. All apparently was meant to culminate in a depiction of the most irreversibly devastating, according to the pessimistic al-Maqrizi, of course, ruin of the city and the country under the sultans of his time, especially the ill-fated Faraj ibn Barquq, al-Mu'ayyad Sheikh, and al-Ashraf Barsbai, whose reigns covered the first third of the 15th century. Al-Maqrizi's deep disappointment in these sultans translated into breaking all measures of caution in reporting their failings, especially after he withdrew from public life in 1415 in despair of ever reconciling his moral indignation with his professional ambitions, something that a lot of us actually are facing. To him, these sultans were no longer the deserving leaders their glorified early Mamluk predecessors had once been, skillfully and thoughtfully managing a great empire and fighting for Islam. Their insatiable greed, neglect of their Mamluk training, and overall un-Islamic policies had led to the devastation of the economy and the impoverishment of the people. This, in turn, halted the growth and prosperity of the city and caused many of its structures to become abandoned and dilapidated. The declining city, therefore, offered al-Maqrizi a powerful tool of criticism. His anxiety, melancholy, and outrage at the general state of affairs may have contributed to the Khitat elegiac tone and its expansiveness and meticulous attention to little architectural, topographical, and historical details. In an explicitly and deliberately romantic statement, he says, "I wanted to gather the reports of what is left in Egypt of the remain, al-H.A.R al-Baqiya, of past nations and bygone centuries, and what is left in al-Fustats of institutions that are about to be erased by erosion and old age and have but a little time before they are engulfed by annihilation and nothingness, and to mention what is left in the city of Al-Qahira of the remains, the H.A.R, of its luminous palaces and what it comprised of khitat and areas, asqa, and contained of finely designed buildings." Sounds like John Ruskin's description of Venice. Al-Maqrizi, perhaps a bit too theatrically, tells of many mosques, madrasas, and palaces resplendent in all their opulence and their illustrious occupants, or of streets filled with the bustle of the city where he played as a child and which no longer existed as he was writing his khitat. In their place were empty alleys and vacant lots with the dilapidated remains of deserted structures. Gone too, in al-Maqrizi's words, were the manifestations of the leisurely and carefree life of the Mamluk capital of yesteryear, with its public festivities, religious processions, and markets stuffed with luxury goods brought from near and far. This heightened notion of loss imbued him with an urgent need to capture cherished memories, both his own and the communities, as they had attached themselves to places and buildings before they slipped away with the disappearance of their settings. He was trying to create what Pierre Nora, in a not so different context, albeit a modern and excessively nationalistic one, termed a lieu de mémoire, a realm of memory, where memories can be saved, recorded, and later recalled. But al-Maqrizi was so despondent at the state his city has fallen into during his last years that he foresaw no prospect of recovery in the future, as the Khaldunian thesis would have implied. This millenarian desperation, which might have had its roots in various prophecies current at the time, is nowhere fully discussed in the Khitat. All we have is a short and cryptic excursus on the diverse Islamic and non-Islamic accounts on the preordained end of the world, tucked in the middle of a larger discussion on a different system of datings used by various nations. After presenting the full gamut of doomsday predictions, some of which are put in his own time or revolve primarily around the destruction of Egypt, al-Maqrizi returns to the traditional Orthodox view that God only knows and refuses to bring his own anguish to a conclusive projection of total devastation. Within its own tradition, the Khitat appears almost as an anachronism, with no real peers or successors, picking up where al-Maqrizi left off until the rise of a nationalistic Egyptian school of history writing in the late 19th century. Certainly, no Mamluk historian managed to absorb the Khaldunian method or to capture the critical mood and intensity of feelings displayed in al-Maqrizi's text. nor did any Khitat compiler in the late Mamluk and early Ottoman periods juxtaposes the pedagogical and moral aims with the topographical and architectural descriptions. They all reverted to the formula of dispassionate inventory seen in earlier Khitat with no underlying historical interpretation. This is why the Khitat stands today not just as an invaluable historical source, but also, and perhaps more powerfully, as an overtly emotional and particularistic historical analysis of the consequences of human action on the urban landscape. It actually prefigures, though in a less self-conscious way and in a melancholy tone, the questions Alois Riegel and other fin de siècle archaeologists encountered as they tried to historicize by reconstituting as wholes the fragments of city spaces and structures, that is, its khitat and its H.A.R, as they appear in al-Maqrizi's title. As such, the khitat may be considered a truly pioneering urban history, perhaps long-winded, cosmocentric, and depressed, but certainly methodical, reflective, and imbued with a strong sense of purpose. This is why al-Maqrizi has been cast as the voice of Egypt's conscience and the witness to its suffering at the hands of its despotic rulers until today. His moral rectitude, audacious stance against corruption and injustice, which actually would have caused him his life, have inspired many an Egyptian modern literature. But the most moving invocation is that of the late activist poet Naguib Surur, who casts al-Maqrizi as a drink companion in one of his most melancholic poems. Composed in September 1977, at the height of President Anwar Sadat's megalomaniacal redefinition of himself as the autocratic devout leader, al-Ra'is al-Mu'min. Drink Delirium, Tada'iyat al-Sukr wal-Daya' is the title of Naguib Surur's poem, is a truly tormented soliloquy against tyranny, cowardice, and indifference. Utterly desperate and suicidally defiant, Surur addresses the silent al-Maqrizi several times. But instead of waiting for the replies of that Maqrizi, Surur thrice glosses al-Maqrizi's critical passages about the abuse of power to explain the current decline in Sadat's Egypt. And I'll read you a passage. What will it be said? Will it be said we chose silence for fears of death? The letter has an edge like a sword, can turn against its speaker. O Maqrizi, you who always come after the deluge, a plague is a plague. It always comes on the tail of a famine. It snatched your daughter and many other daughters as the wolf was standing guard. I hereby solemnly swear, Maqrizi, not to leave this world without scandal. I ask no one for justice. True justice is not to be begged. Our judges are high priests. Our high priests are distant, and all are traitors. Let someone else write poetry. I am writing the khitat of Maqrizi. His road map is my guide in the sea of darkness. I'm looking for my homeland in my homeland, but I do not lose my way in the plunge, or the noise, or the shouting, or the violence. Let others write poetry. I will not pen down a single line or a single verse for the sake of poetry. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, just a
I'll
second.
start then. This was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nasser. I've been interested in the reception of Ibn Khaldun and Maqrizi in the later centuries by the Ottomans, as I'm sure you know. And one of the most interesting things about Maqrizi's reception, and both the Khitat and the Igatha were translated at certain contexts, in certain contexts which make very good sense in terms of why Maqrizi would be relevant. I'll just go for the second one because that's what my question is based on. Exactly in the year 1600, great monetary turbulence and inflation, the vizier admiral in charge of monetary reform of the Genoese family of Cicala was trying to find some solution out of the dilemma, and a scholar, son of the famous Taşköprüzade who wrote biographical dictionary, said, well, I read Maqrizi, and I think he offers us a way out, and I'm happy to translate it for you. And he says, I rushed through this translation. Within a few days, I had to finish it. I may have made some mistakes, and he adds an afterword to it, etc. But in any case, it is a profoundly optimistic reception of Maqrizi, because he says Maqrizi shows us that calamities come and go. In the past, there have been calamities, and people have somehow managed to deal with them, and Egypt continued to generate newly prosperous rule, or generations of people inhabiting Cairo, etc., etc. So it is possible, I guess, at least after a certain point, to also give a non-pessimistic reading
Of the Ighatha,
of Ighatha.
but not of the Khitat.
Not of the Khitat.
That's the point. The Ighatha was written in 1406. The Khitat goes on. The last entry in the Khitat is 1442. So we have 34, 35 years of writing of the Khitat. And the Khitat started initially in the way, a lot of people are writing on, if you want, the sources of al-Maqrizi. It started initially more as a praise of Fatimid Cairo. That's the first redaction that we have. He wasn't yet collecting material about his own time. And the Suluk, which is his own chronicle of the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, is written until about 10 days before his death, is the last entry in there. And if you read a Suluk, which actually somehow is moving along with the Khitat in the last 10, 15 years, the Suluk is actually one of his latest books to have started. And it is basically his own observation. And you see him getting gloomier and gloomier in time. So he starts initially describing, he starts from Salah ad-Din, and Salah ad-Din, of course, is a great hero as far as he's concerned. It gets down to Nasser Muhammad, middle of the 14th century, and then he starts, you can start seeing in the language of that book how he is sort of like becoming more and more critical and more pessimistic. And as a matter of fact, actually, the Ighatha is one of the evidence that we can use in order to show that his mood is changing. He wrote the Ighatha immediately, 2 months after he was dismissed from the Hisbah. And at that time, he was still very much interested in returning to the administration. So he wrote the Ighatha and sent it to the Sultan in order to basically gain favor by saying, look, I have a view about the economic policy. And of course, actually, at that time, he wasn't yet on the exterior of the administration. He was part of the administration. He had been actually a boon companion of the Sultan just 3 years before or 4 years before. It was the, in my opinion, again, this is just really interpretation, it's the execution, the very unfair execution of his last patron, who was the vizier, whose name was Fathallah, and who was a Jewish convert. And Maqrizi spent 20 years with him, and he was executed by al-Mu'ayyad Sheikh in 1413. And in 1415, al-Maqrizi stops seeking any position, any attempt at actually gaining favor with the sultans and going back to the administration. So there is his disappointment, which actually Robert Irwin and others would not want to see his position as a moralistic one. They want to see it as more of an opportunistic one. I think it's much more moralistic when you start analyzing the text sentence by sentence. But there is a development. So the Ighatha is actually a point in time in which he's thinking that there is a possibility of rescuing what's happening to the economy of Egypt. And I don't know, the Ighatha, and ultimately actually it's he has two short treatises on money and nuqud. And he's extremely orthodox in them. This is why in 1600 I would understand that this is sort of like the height of orthodoxy in the Ottoman Empire, and it is, of course, when you will bring someone who is so orthodoxically oriented. He's saying that the saving of the economy is to return to the gold base. which actually, I mean, after Nixon, we have also the same kind of arguments in here. So he is saying we need to go back to gold and silver, and that's the only way to save the economy, and we have to basically cancel these copper fulus. And the copper fulus are the means of corruption because the government can play with the value of the copper fulus, whereas the gold and silver carry their value. And if you read those treatises, and the Ighatha is the first one, of course, the Ighatha, he goes, as I was saying, the cyclical history of like rise and fall, famine, a lot of people die, then there is a new dynasty, and this is very much Khaldunian, and you can see that. But once he gets, because at the end of the Ighatha, he talks his first sort of like recommendation for restoration of the economy, and it's that orthodox one. He repeats it again in the two treatises, and one of them, the Ighatha, is written under Faraj. The other one is written under al-Muayyad Sheikh. There is still a time in which, because Faraj was succeeded by, actually killed by al-Muayyad Sheikh, and Muayyad Sheikh takes over, he is still hopeful. He is still wanting to be in the administration. And then he gives up, he goes back home, he sits there and he writes. And his criticism of the rulers is something that way less criticism of the rulers had caused people to be cut in half. So there is a certain courage in his writing because his contemporaries are commenting on his foolishness. So he's not writing for himself. People are reading what he's writing. And he's saying, the Sultan is venal, the Sultan is doing this, the Sultan is doing that, and goes after him, after the failings, one after the other, from the confiscation of the long-term business that Barsbay has done, and actually, in my opinion, but I think Janet Abu Lugod also had noticed that, this has had an amazing effect. This is the beginning of Europe trying to look for another way to get to India, because Barsbay now starts actually tariffs. A very good word for today as well. So you have this mountain tariff that the Sultan is imposing when he takes over the business of the Karim traders. All of that happens during his lifetime, and he is very much aware of that, and he is reacting to it by just showing that this is a state in decline. But it seems to me that at a certain point, and it's also because he lost all of his children, so he becomes lonely. In 1422, he's basically living alone. Between 1422 and 1444, which is when he dies, he's alone. So his despondency starts becoming very clear, even in the way he's reporting on. And today the Sultan did that. You feel that that sentence is very different than the one that he wrote just 10 years ago.
So first of all, thank you for reinfusing his soul back into the book, because I've been reading so much of al-Khitat as a source for all kinds of things, and it's very nice to see him back in the book. So thank you for that. My question is quite selfish because it's reflected from my own research in Damascus. You had put both al-Maqrizi and Ibn Khaldun as interested in both the state and the city, and they only diverge in the sense that al-Maqrizi is a local case study. So in the Mamluk period, from a Damascene point of view, it's the city versus the state, right? And that's where I see the local responses in Damascus as to the kind of knowledge production that is produced by the state. So I'm really intrigued by Maqrizi, the duo, in the sense that Ibn Khaldun, when he comes to Cairo, he revises his work from a regional to a world history and adds to it the world map, the Idrisian tradition, right? And all of the bureaucrats of Cairo, the big, like the big knowledge producers like al-Umari, al-Qalqashandi, thank you, and what's his name, the third, anyway. So they all are using these same maps, and they're producing a kind of knowledge that is very bureaucratic and very state for the state. So I'm wondering where al-Maqrizi, Ibn Khaldun, who's a part of the enterprise in a way, but where does al-Maqrizi in the end, in terms of his knowledge production, stand in this like tableau?
Well, I mean, there's something similar to Jamal's question in there, is that al-Maqrizi stands initially within the group of people, his peers. I mean, the person that he ultimately is going to become an enemy of is al-Aini, who will become the court historian and who will sit night after night in the court of Barsbay translating his Aqd al-Juman to Turkish as he reads, so that Barsbhai would understand. And supposedly Barsbhai said, if it wasn't for Al-Aini, we would have lost our Islam. So there is a competition between these two. Maqrizi not being a Turkish speaker, Al-Aini being like a lackey to authority. Al-Aini is the one that insults al-Maqrizi, and Maqrizi in all of his writing is much more careful in actually treating his opponents among the ulama. He is very straightforward when he speaks about the Mamluks, very open about his opinion about them, but you don't know exactly how he feels about the ulama. He maintains a certain decorum in his treatment of ulama. And that is, in my opinion, his attempt at staying within that group of knowledge production that he feels that he is part of, but he didn't manage to score so high, so he's dismissed by many of them. I mean, Al-Aini calls him a geomancer and dismisses him as a historian. Sakhawi calls him a plagiarist, and a colleague of ours in Belgium has built all of his career in proving that he was a plagiarist. He has written hundreds of pages on that. And Ibn H.A.R, who is now the top scholar in Cairo in the early 15th century, is the one that actually rescues him and says that, I mean, this guy is really one of the best historians that I have encountered. So he is teetering in between being part of the official knowledge producers and being an outsider. And it seems to me that that outsider quality is allowing him to be much more critical than those who are still in the competition for positions. He's no longer in the competition for positions. When he is writing his books, he's out. It's the treatises that were still in the competition, and that's why perhaps Jamal is noticing that it is still positive. It's positive because he's still hoping. So he is between your Cairo and Damascus group of people.
Thank you very much, the Nasser Hoja. I have a question regarding the causality of the Maqrizi, and would you please elaborate on this, the notion, and how that causality plays out with the notion of the pessimism? Because asbab theory, as I understood from the theological and also, you know, the part of the Maqrizian reading, is an empowering theory that you have a certain control over the asbab. And, you know, would you please?
I'll give you two examples, and the two of them are extremely important. The first is actually to just respond to the idea of pessimism. Why is this happening? Because he's actually seeing in the actions of the rulers the reasons for ruination. So his depiction of ruination is not something that God has sort of like decided that we are going to ruin this country. He's actually saying that they are going away from Sharia. This is something that he goes back over and over and over again. Actually, I mean, this is not to go out of this room, and it's being recorded in here, but Maqrizi reminded me, for those of you who know the history of Islamic fundamentalism, he reminds me of Abdullah Azzam, the theorist, if you want, of Al-Qaeda. Because al-Maqrizi, who lacked any courage of going out and fighting, he himself sees himself as a man of the pen, but he is really a fiery critique, and most of his criticism is to go back to the orthodoxy, that this is needed in order to restore the status of the state. And when he praises earlier rulers, it's really, I mean, there is part of it is him somehow overlooking their shortcomings in order to emphasize their adherence to Sharia. So the causality, the relationship between ruination and ultimately the destruction of the country and the causes are very clear. He analyzes them. He goes through them one by one, but he is very much focused on, again, the venality and the corruption of the Mamluk class. And the corruption of the Mamluk class, not just of the Sultan, as I read that section, he's actually saying that the whole Mamluk class, which somehow earned its right to rule Egypt, is losing that right at my time. But let me take you to actually a place where Maqrizi and Ibn Khaldun do something that no historian of the time does. And Ibn Khaldun on the sly, Maqrizi openly and straightforward. And that is, Maqrizi accepts the genealogy of the Fatimid as descendants of the Prophet. This is something that would ruin your career in 15th century Egypt. You cannot say that these Shiite dynasty, Ismaili dynasty, are actually descendants of the Prophet because they were considered to be Ubaidullah descendants, and that he was either a Majus, a Zoroastrian, or a Jew, depending on which source you're looking at, and that they claim descendants from the Prophet. He goes through, in the beginning of his book on the Fatimid, he has a book on the history of the Fatimid, he goes through the evidence one by one and shows you that there is no way of denying their descendants or their genealogy going back to Muhammad. And in order to protect himself somehow, he actually keeps on saying, and I'm bara of their creed. I am not a believer of their creed, but I actually am here to straighten the historical record. I want to show that these people are indeed the descendants of the Prophet. So it seems to me this is something that shows his, and Ibn Khaldun does the same thing. But then Sakhawi, who is really the most malicious biographer of the 15th century, goes after the two of them, and he says, Maqrizi is naive. And Maqrizi thinks that he's a descendant of the Fatimid, which he does, and therefore he is going to actually approve of their origin. Ibn Khaldun is a fox, because Ibn Khaldun hates the family of the Prophet, because Ibn Khaldun is not a believer. This is what Sakhawi wants us to believe. And therefore, Ibn Khaldun says that the descendant of Ali, the Fatimid that is, who are such despised dynasty, are indeed his descendant. So it's actually, Ibn Khaldun is approving their claim in order to somehow destroy the reputation of their forefather, of course, the father of Shiism. Whereas Maqrizi is actually doing it, in my opinion, of course, actually, he feels that he's the descendant of the Fatimid, but if you read those 20 pages in which he's arguing about their genealogy, they are absolutely modern historical writing of like, this is the reason for that claim. Let me show you the fragility of the claim of their opponents, and he goes through a very logical argument. So I think he earned his position as someone who does believe in causality, not in fatalism. Salim.
You said that people who wrote Khitat after Maqrizi had disemboweled kind of narrative, presumably because was not conceptual or not interpretive. Would you say this about Kurd Ali?
Kurd Ali is 20th century, and his writing is very much influenced by his exposure to French education at that time. And Kurd Ali was someone who studied, or at least he was influenced by French late 19th century writing. So I'm really specifically speaking about Khitat writers in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century that appeared mostly in Egypt. There is only one in Syria, Ibn Tulun al-Salihi, who is a little bit later. But otherwise, I mean, these individuals, when they go back to description of building, there is no lesson from the description of building. And the moral lessons are driven or are derived from other sources of observation. So that's the difference that I'm talking about. I mean, one of the most famous is, for example, As-Suyuti, who is almost a contemporary. I mean, he's a generation younger than Maqrizi. He writes Hasan al-Muhadara fi Mahasin Misr wal-Qahira, and it's an extremely banal book, even though he actually glosses al-Maqrizi many times. But there is no sense of historicity in his writing.
But Kurd Ali has a parallel because he was writing at the end of Empire also.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, before we get to Kurd Ali, we have a much more important, of course, al-Khitat Tawfiqiyya. So Ali Mubarak it glosses the whole book. Ali Mubarak is very postmodern. He basically takes al-Khitat of al-Maqrizi and updates it to his own time. But al-Khitat of al-Maqrizi is copied word by word in Ali Mubarak, which is interesting. He's a graduate of Pont et Chaussée. Should we say thank you? Thank you all for coming.